How's it going, everybody? Just pulling out of Best Buy here. Just bought this dash cam. And quite honestly, the reason I bought the dash cam was because I kind of wanted to film more videos in the car talking about theological subjects or health subjects. If it's on my other channel, A Mind for Fitness, but I haven't done anything on A Mind for Fitness for about 3 years. But I'm thinking of starting up some more stuff again over there. But, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to or not. But let's start with today's topic. So today's topic is going to be on my theological drive here. Let's think of something I can kind of riff about. And that is why I am not a dispensationalist. I guess if somebody kind of asked me that question off the cuff, I could kind of answer it. And no one's asked me that, by the way. I just thought I'd talk about it. Why I'm not a dispensationalist. So, why am I not a dispensationalist? Well, that requires, first of all, to ask the question, what is dispensationalism? And just, if I say, hey, I'm not a dispensationalist, you might think, oh, well, you're automatically covenant theology, and I'm not. I'm what's called New Covenant theology. I'm in that ballpark somewhere. I certainly don't agree with covenant theology necessarily on some core issues, but I certainly don't agree with dispensational theology on some core issues as well. Now, of course, I'm probably more in line with covenant theology on bigger picture issues like the relationship between the church and Israel kind of thing, at least some forms of covenant theology, that the church is the new covenant representation of Israel, and is what everything God had promised and focused on and driving. But I also disagree with a lot of the core fundamental doctrines. But as far as, kind of big picture stuff, I agree with covenant theology more than I agree with dispensational theology. But so I don't want people to kind of anticipate. That's why I brought it up, because I don't want people to kind of anticipate what they think I'm going to say. Because they think, oh, I know all these problems with covenant theology, and I'm going to refute you because I know these problems with covenant theology. That ain't going to happen with me, because that's not what's going on. I disagree with both covenant theology and dispensational theology, but why? Well, what is dispensational theology? What is it? Why do I not agree with it? Enough introduction. Well, dispensational theology, I think if we boiled it down to what dispensational theology is, if I had to say, give me a sentence or two or a paragraph at most at what dispensational theology is, I would say that dispensational theology is the belief at its very core that God owes Israel, by way of covenant, things that are not fulfilled in the New Testament, in the church, and in Christ. Or at least not yet in Christ. Okay, so that's very important. Now, it goes beyond just what's prophetic. It goes beyond just what's talked about. It goes beyond just what's said in the New Testament. To really be a dispensationalist, you have to believe that by way of covenant, that God has obligations to Israel that are not fulfilled in Christ, at least Christ in his current administration, or in the church in general, or in the eschatological future. That was a little tricky. Or the eternal state, I should say. that there are things mentioned in the Old Testament that do not point to that by way of covenant again, do not point to the church and do not point to the eternal state, but a point to either a 7-year tribulation or the millennial period, in which God will fulfill those promises. Now, why do I disagree with that? Now, a lot of times we could go to, a lot of the major disagreements around a 7-year tribulation in the first place, a pre-tribulational rapture of the church. A lot of those things I find are a little bit ancillary, because, you have people who are dispensationalists who believe in a pre-tribulational rapture, a mid-tribulational rapture, a post-tribulational rapture, a pre-wrath rapture, which I like. I like the pre-wrath rapture. Although I don't. Anyway, off to the side, I'm not technically a pre-wrath rapture as it is defined by dispensationalism. But you could go to a lot of those places and say, see, we're going to be here. They're Christians, obviously. That's where the battleground's been laid and fought and talked about for many years. But the real reason I'm not a dispensationalist really has to do with the fact of how the New Testament consistently looks at promises to Israel and applies them to Christ and the church. And I really am amazed at how dispensationalists, I literally don't understand it. I really don't. Over and over and over and over again, the New Testament takes verses from the Old Testament and applies them to what either Christ did, or in the eternal state, either what he did on the cross or in establishing the church, and applies them to either what Christ did or the church in the day of the apostles, which is just like I don't understand how you can read the New Testament and not see that. For example, the whole Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, when they finally get together and talk about how these Gentiles are coming into the church and what they should do about it. And they take a passage out of, I'm going to forget here off the cuff, Amos, I think. But it says that God will rebuild his temple, that he will rebuild the foundations of David. And then they apply that, they use that as the explanation as to why Gentiles are coming into the church. So I don't see, unless you think that the apostles are wrong in their interpretation of the Old Testament, I do not see it. I really don't. I'm always flabbergasted at dispensationalism, because I'm like, look, I'm reading it right here. It says, for example, the Davidic covenant, Peter says, is fulfilled in the resurrection of Christ in Acts chapter 2. He quotes the promise that he'll set one of David's descendants on his throne. He quotes that promise, and then he says, thus God spoke concerning the resurrection of Christ. So you either have to do some sharp intellectual gymnastics as to why that's happening, or you have to believe that Peter knew what he was talking about, and he applied the Davidic covenant, the Davidic promise that God would set one of David's descendants on his throne, and he applied that to the resurrection of Christ. It says it, thus he spoke concerning the resurrection of Christ. And this happens time and time and time again in the New Testament. So I'm forced. Now this also goes back to another issue with dispensational theology. And dispensational theology really literally believes that that promises in the Old Testament should be taken as literally as possible, unless prophecies and promises and covenants should be taken as literally as possible, unless you just can't. I just disagree with that. Did the apostles do that? They didn't. Now, does that mean that some promises or prophecies aren't fulfilled literally, like the crucifixion of Christ and stuff like that? Yeah, of course. But I would say that God is, in the Old Testament, is speaking in some measure in code. And the reason being, and this is what Paul says, the Apostle Paul says, he says if he just laid everything out, then they would have never crucified the Lord of glory. They just wouldn't have crucified him. So, obviously, you can't go to the Old Testament and go, well, here's a literal hermeneutic concerning prophecy, and say, well, that's what it means. So, for example, temple promises and things like that, especially when in the New Testament, those things are all applied to the church and to Christ. I just don't see how you get around it. Now, that's not to say, here's a little bit of a rabbit trail. I'm not saying that that we should interpret the Bible allegorically or anything like that. Of course not. I mean, I'm a young earther. I'm a six-day creationist, subject for another video. But when the New Testament comes along, and like in Ephesians chapter 2, it says that you were strangers and aliens to the commonwealth of Israel, but you've been brought near to basically by implication, the commonwealth of Israel. And, all these Old Testament symbols, not just symbols, but realities, are now placed inside the church and what God is doing inside the church. And it's not like this, again, it's not like this just happens once. Now, excuse me, I don't have notes, I might be trailing off. We'll see how this sounds. It's not like this just happens one time. This happens over and over again in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, the New Testament is replete with verses that continually say that the Old Testament covenants and promises are either fulfilled in Christ and in the church now, or fulfilled in the eternal state. So in the eschatological, when Christ returns and there's a new heaven and a new earth, and fulfilled there. And so the Old Testament, many of the Old Testament covenants, I would say the covenants for sure, but prophecies and promises and stuff either point to the church as it is now, or the eternal state, the church as it will be in the eschaton. So that's it for now. We'll see how this video went, and we'll see what kind of reaction I get from this. All right, we'll see you later. Thanks. Have a good day, and God bless all of you.